Today, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, or Tarquin the Elder, is mostly remembered as the father or grandfather of the last Roman king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquin the Proud. However, Lucius was actually a strong king in his own right. Lucius was a military man who greatly expanded the holdings of Rome. He essentially fought every major early Roman enemy, from the Etruscans to the Sabines. Lucius led campaigns against them all. So what did all these wars result in for Rome? Were the wars worth it? Let's talk about it. Before we get any further into today's episode, I just want to quickly ask that you subscribe and like if you enjoy my content. It really helps the channel out and it motivates me to make more content. Also, follow me on Twitter to get updates about any videos in progress. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. As has become normal for this series, I want to quickly note here that we should take much of these stories with a bit of skepticism. Many of the deeds, and even the people themselves in the histories of this period, may not have been real, or may not have happened in the way we are told they did. Just keep that in mind as we talk about Lucius. We don't know much about Lucius's early life. In fact, the only thing we really do know is that Lucius was not Roman, nor was he a Sabine. Instead, Lucius was an Etruscan. Yes, you heard that right. Lucius was an Etruscan, the eternal enemy of both the Roman kingdom and the early Roman Republic. Lucius came from the Etruscan city of Tarquini. His father, Demartius of Corinth, was a very wealthy Greek. As the name implies, Demartius came from the city of Corinth in Greece. Demartius was apparently charged with sedition back in Corinth, and thus fled with his entire fortune to the city of Tarquini. Demartius seemed to be uninterested in political office, but Lucius was not his father, and almost immediately upon inheriting his father's fortune, he began to seek public office. Sadly, for Lucius at least, the Etruscans were completely unwilling to allow a lowly Greek to attain any office in their glorious city. I hope you can sense the sarcasm there. With this rejection, Lucius's wife, Tanaquil, advised Lucius to relocate to Rome. Tanaquil was a skilled prophetess, and she foresaw that her husband could be a great leader. Upon Lucius's arrival to the city of Rome, we are told that an eagle took off his cap, flew away, and then shortly returned and placed the cap back on his head. Tanaquil believed this to be an omen of Lucius's future greatness. Livy states that Lucius gained respect among the ruling class through his courtesy. I also imagine that his great wealth helped along the way. In any case, Lucius eventually rose to be a trusted advisor to the Roman king Ansus Marcius. In fact, he was so trusted that Ansus named him the guardian of his children upon his death. Sadly, this was not a great move by Ansus, as Lucius used this position to strengthen his own case for the throne upon the death of Ansus. Lucius was able to ensure that the sons of Ansus were conveniently absent from the city of Rome when Ansus died, and using his position as guardian, Lucius was able to convince the Roman people and the Senate that he should be elected as king, as Ansius's sons were, quote, still youths. The truth of this matter is a little blurry. The fact that Ansus felt the need to appoint Lucius as guardian in the first place points towards there being some truth in the matter. However, this could have just as easily been a ruse made up by Lucius. In the end, it doesn't really matter, as Lucius was elected king in 616 BCE. Livy tells us that Lucius's first act was to increase the size of the Roman Senate by inviting 100 men from the leading minor families of Rome. The only real family of note was that of Octavia. Does that sound familiar? It should, as this was the family that Augustus, born as Octavian, would be descended from. This meant that the Roman Senate was now at 300 members. He did this with the hope that these new senators would be loyal and indebted to him, and thus secure his position as king. This really makes sense. Remember that the sons of Ansus were still kicking around and could easily serve as figures for rebellions. This seemed to have worked, as we have no record of any rebellions against Lucius during his reign. Of course, those records could have simply been lost. However, as far as we know, this did secure his position. Lucius faced his first militaristic test sometime prior to 588 BCE. We know this because the Fasti Triumphalis, the record of Roman triumphs, tells us that Lucius celebrated a triumph in 588 BCE. This triumph was in celebration of his victory over the Latins. Livy tells us that the Latins claimed that the treaties that they had negotiated with Romulus and the other Roman kings no longer applied to Lucius, and thus they had no obligation against declaring war. The Latins launched the first attacks. We don't really know what these attacks were, or if this is even true, but Lucius saw these attacks not as a threat, but as an opportunity. You see, Lucius wanted to incorporate the Latins into the Roman state, and this war seemed like a great opportunity to do so. We are told that Lucius quickly conquered several Latin cities, including Appiae, where it is claimed that Lucius took large spoils of war. It would seem that the Latins sensed that they were close to defeat, and they decided to appeal to the Etruscans and the Sabines for help against Rome. I'm sure we can guess how the Etruscans and the Sabines responded. They were always game for a fight against Rome. Lucius could see the folly in splitting his forces to fight all three of his enemies, and thus stayed focused on the Latins. Lucius was able to defeat the Latins, and thus turned to deal with the Sabines. The Sabines had already crossed the Anio River. This meant that they were far too close to Rome for comfort. Lucius decided that he must give battle or risk a siege of Rome, which at this point had no great fortifications. Livy tells us that this battle was very bloody, but was inconclusive. Eventually, the two sides both pulled back and set up encampments. It was at this point that Lucius determined that the issue was that Rome lacked enough cavalry, and increased the amount of equites, the Roman social class which served as the Roman cavalry force. The second battle is actually recorded in more detail than usual by Livy. Livy states that the Romans began the battle by sending flaming rafts up the Anio River. These rafts destroyed the bridge that the Sabines had used to cross the river, thus completely cutting off the main escape route. After this, the two sides sent their infantry at each other. We are told that the Sabines seemed to be winning against the Roman infantry, and the battle looked quite bleak for the Romans. However, just as the Roman center began to give, the Roman cavalry flanked the Sabine lines. The Sabines were quickly routed, and we are told that most either died from the Roman cavalry chasing them down, or drowned in the Anio River, attempting to escape. Livy even states that the Sabine soldiers' arms floated down the Anio River, into the Tiber, and past Rome. The citizens of Rome thus realized that their king had triumphed before word of his victory arrived in the city. Lucius quickly pressed his advantage, and crossed into Sabine territory. The Sabines quickly raised a new army, but they were also quickly defeated by Rome, and the Sabines had no choice but to sue for peace. The Sabine town of Colotia and its surrounding territory and population were ceded to Rome, and Lucius returned to Rome to celebrate his second triumph. We are told that Lucius celebrated his triumph in a, quote, Etruscan style. This included a chariot pulled by white horses, and a gold-decorated toga along with the tunica palmatia, which was a tunic embroidered with palm leaves. This seems like a good time to talk about the other Etruscan styles and items that Lucius introduced to Rome. We are told that Lucius introduced the scepter, the trabea, a purple fabric typically used in cloaks, fasciuses, worn by lictors, the curule chair, the toga praetexia, a white toga with a broad purple stripe, the rings worn by senators, the paludumentium, later military coat, or the falera, a metal disc that was worn on the chests of soldiers or on banners during a military parade. And, according to Strabo, Lucius also brought to Rome the sacrificial and fortune-telling rites, as well as the tube that was used to give orders on the battlefield. That's a lot, and we have some conflicting information here. After all, Romulus was said to use a curule chair. It is probably true that Lucius introduced several Etruscan styles into Roman society, but I think some of these examples are really just placeholders made by Livy and other Roman historians. Remember, we are told that Lucius was an Etruscan, and thus it would make sense that he would be the person to introduce the styles and items that Livy could trace back to the Etruscans. Or maybe I am just completely wrong and Lucius really did introduce all these items. Let me know what you think down below. In any case, Lucius and Rome quickly returned to war with the Etruscans. Remember when I told you that the Latins appealed to the Etruscans and the Sabines for help in their war against Rome? Well, some Etruscans did answer the call to arms. 5 Etruscan cities sent forces to aid the Sabines in their battle with the Romans, and apparently the Romans had taken quite a few of them as prisoners. As you can imagine, the 5 Etruscan cities were not very happy with this, and they refused to sign any peace with Rome until the prisoners were returned. The Romans were unwilling to return those prisoners, and thus the war stood in a state of limbo. That was, until the 5 Etruscan cities were able to gain the backing of a further 7. We are not told the names of any of these cities, but we are told that the Etruscans struck first, taking the city of Fidene, the first colony of Rome, supposedly founded by Romulus himself. Fidene quickly became the focal point for the war. We are told that after several bloody battles, the Romans emerged victorious. Very specific, right? In any case, the cities that had fought against Rome were subjugated by Lucius, and Lucius celebrated his 3rd triumph. We are also told that at some point, Lucius conquered the cities of Cornicellum, Old Facilia, Cameria, Crostumenarium, Ameriola, Medulla, and Nomentum, all of which were Latin cities. The details of these further wars are essentially non-existent, and we really have no clue what happened. All we are left with is that Rome had greatly expanded its borders, and that each of Lucius's wars had brought great wealth to the Eternal City. Lucius was not all consumed with war, however. He would actually construct several important buildings inside of Rome, presumably with the loot he gained from his various wars. Lucius was said to be the person to order the construction of the Circus Maximus, or at least set the land aside for its construction. The Circus Maximus was the first stadium to be built in Rome. It's set in the flat valley of Murcia, in between the Aventine and the Palatine hills. Lucius was said to have built raised wooden platforms for the upper echelons of Roman society. These platforms were shaded via an awning. At this time, the Circus Maximus was essentially a trackway surrounded by farmland. It wouldn't really become the massive stadium complex until later in the Roman Republic. However, Lucius really can only be credited with establishing the idea of the Circus Maximus. Still, Lucius was credited with establishing yearly games and was said to have imported the first horses and invited boxers from Etruria, the Etruscans' homeland. Lucius was also said to have been the creator of the original Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest sewage systems. Lucius used this system to drain the damp and swampish lowlands of Rome, but it would eventually evolve into a city-wide sewage system, with parts that are even still used today. Lucius also built Rome's first stone wall, and began the construction of a temple to Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. All in all, Lucius is said to have been the originator of 2 of Rome's most famous architectural wonders in the Circus Maximus and the Cloaca Maxima, both of which would be used for centuries, and even millennia afterwards. Lucius would face his death in 578 BCE. Legend states that Ansus Marcius' sons arranged Lucius's assassination. They disguised this plot as a riot, where Lucius received a death blow to the head. However, his wife, Tanaquil, stated that the king was merely wounded and that he would recover. She did this in order to establish Severus Tullius as regent and eventually as king, but more on that in the next episode. Lucius would leave behind a fairly impressive legacy. He conquered several Latin, Etruscan, and Sabine cities. He defeated the 3 main Roman enemies of the time and still had time to build, or at least establish, 2 of Rome's most famous buildings in the Circus Maximus and the Cloaca Maxima. He also introduced several regal symbols and technologies from his native Etruscan land that would serve as symbols for Rome for centuries to come. Truly, Lucius is the most underrated Roman king. Sadly, his grandson, or son if you choose to believe Livy, would not be so great, and would eventually lead to the downfall of the Roman monarchy. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. I apologize if this video felt a bit all over the place. We are told that Lucius did a lot, but we aren't really given much detail, and sadly this makes it kind of feel disconnected. I hope I did a fair enough job of condensing the information for you. If you have any comments or questions on the video, or believe I've made a mistake, please comment down below. And please like and subscribe if you enjoyed. It really helps the channel out. Peace.